Las Vegas, September 7th, 1996. The MGM Grand was lit up the way it always was. 10,000 people inside to watch Mike Tyson fight Bruce Seldon. Ringside seats, press row, high rollers. And among them, Tupac Amaru Shakur. He was 25 years old, wearing a black vest with no shirt, his tattoos, thug life in Gothic letters across his stomach, the wings on his chest, catching the arena lights. He was laughing, talking, moving through the crowd the way he always moved, like the room had already arranged itself around him before he arrived. And that night, in that city, he had no reason to believe it would end any way except well. He didn't know it was the last night. The fight ended fast. Seldon went down in the first round, and most people hadn't finished settling into their seats. The crowd filed out with the particular deflation that comes from something ending before it had the chance to mean anything. They had paid for a spectacle and gotten 90 seconds. People were frustrated. Some were drunk. The energy in the MGM corridor was restless and unresolved. What happened in the lobby has been documented, photographed, and argued over so extensively that the footage, the testimony, and the theory have blurred into something simultaneously specific and contested. A young man named Orlando Anderson, 23 years old, a member of the Southside Compton Crips, was spotted by someone in Tupac's entourage. And here is what preceded it. A few weeks earlier, at a Foot Locker in a Lakewood mall, Anderson or someone connected to him had snatched a death row medallion from a member of Tupac's camp. In the world Tupac inhabited by 1996, that kind of disrespect did not go unaddressed. Words were exchanged. Then it escalated the way it always escalates when there are too many people involved, too much pride at stake, and when everyone in the room understands that reputation is a currency you cannot afford to lose publicly. Fists. A pile of men on the lobby floor. The MGM surveillance cameras caught it. Grainy, ambiguous footage that looks both damning and inconclusive depending on what you already believe when you sit down to watch it. Somewhere in that pile was the most famous rapper in the world, throwing punches at a man whose name most of the people watching would never know. Security intervened. Police were called. People dispersed. After, they piled into cars. Tupac rode with Suge Knight, Marin Suge Knight, the CEO of Death Row Records, 6'2", 300 pounds, a man who had built a hip-hop empire by being the person nobody wanted to cross. They were in Suge's black BMW 750IL. The convoy around them was Death Row associates and friends, heading toward Club 662. Named for what the numbers spelled on a telephone keypad. Mob. It was Suge's club. The night wasn't over. They moved through the Strip, past the Bellagio, the Venetian, the Caesars. All that light designed to make you forget what time it is and what tomorrow looks like. Saturday night in Las Vegas. The completely ordinary chaos of a city built on spectacle. At approximately 11:15 p.m., the convoy stopped at a red light at the intersection of Flamingo Road and Covell Lane. A white Cadillac pulled alongside. What followed took seconds. The driver's side window was down. 4 shots. Possibly more, the exact count has been disputed across multiple investigations. The bullets entered through the passenger side window of the BMW. 2 struck Tupac. 1 in his chest, 1 in his pelvis. Suge was hit in the head by a fragment. The Cadillac accelerated through the intersection and was gone. And then consider what happened next. The BMW kept moving, because sometimes the body doesn't immediately process what has just been done to it. Suge drove. He was later criticized for not going directly to the hospital, for driving erratically, for eventually being pulled over by police who had heard the shots. What mattered was that Tupac Shakur was bleeding heavily in the passenger seat, conscious but fading, and the nearest hospital was University Medical Center. He made it there alive. He was in surgery for hours. The internal damage was severe. The chest wound had caused a collapsed lung, and complications compounded through the days that followed. Afeni Shakur flew in from Atlanta. She stayed. For 6 days, the world watched through press conferences and hospital bulletins, through the collective held breath of people who had grown up listening to him and felt something proprietary about his voice. Outside the hospital, fans gathered. Radio stations played his music continuously. There were vigils. There were prayers. On September 13, 1996, at 4:03 in the afternoon, Tupac Amaru Shakur was pronounced dead. He was 25 years old. To understand any of it, you have to go back, further back than the music, further back than the fame. You have to go back to a woman in a courtroom, pregnant, representing herself. Afeni Shakur was born Alice Faye Williams in 1947 in Lumberton, North Carolina. She was poor, she was sharp, and she moved to New York as a teenager with the belief that the city held something the small town could not offer. She found it, eventually, though not in the forms anyone might have predicted. She joined the Black Panther Party in 1968, and it gave her a framework for the anger she had been living inside since childhood. The Panthers were a complicated organization, genuinely revolutionary in their community programs, and simultaneously factionalized, surveilled, and infiltrated by a federal government that, in the words of J. Edgar Hoover, considered them the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. That assessment says more about the country than it does about the Panthers. But it also explains the resources deployed against them. Wiretaps, informants, manufactured violence between rival organizations, and prosecutions. In 1969, Afeni and 20 other Panther members were arrested and charged with conspiracy, bombing department stores, police headquarters, a railroad. The evidence, when it was examined in court, turned out to be largely fabricated or supplied by a government informant named Ralph White, who had been paid to infiltrate the organization. And then consider what she did. Afeni represented herself for significant portions of the 8-month trial. She cross-examined the informant directly. She exposed the weaknesses in the government's case with the kind of methodical persistence that trained lawyers spend years developing. She was pregnant throughout the trial. The child she was carrying was Tupac. The Panther 21 were acquitted on all charges on May 13, 1971. The jury returned a not guilty verdict on all 156 counts in less than 90 minutes. 27 days later, on June 16, 1971, Afeni gave birth in East Harlem to a boy she named Tupac Amaru Shakur. The name carried deliberate weight. Tupac Amaru II was a Peruvian revolutionary who led a massive indigenous uprising against Spanish colonial rule in the 1780s, was captured and publicly executed in Cusco's main plaza in 1781, in a manner designed to terrorize the population into submission, and whose rebellion continued after his death. Amaru means shining serpent in Quechua. Shakur is Arabic for thankful to God. The revolutionary movement his mother had dedicated herself to was being crushed in real time. COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, had specifically targeted the Panthers with a ferocity that went beyond law enforcement. By 1971, key figures were dead, imprisoned, or in exile. Fred Hampton had been shot by police in his bed in Chicago in 1969. Huey Newton was in and out of prison. The movement that Afeni had risked everything for, that she had carried this child through, was fracturing under external pressure and internal contradiction. Tupac was born into the aftermath. The years that followed were hard in the unglamorous way that poverty is hard. Not dramatic, just grinding. They moved, New York to the Bronx to Baltimore, Baltimore to Atlanta, Atlanta eventually to Marin City in California. The instability was constant. Tupac Shakur, a politically committed man who was sentenced to 60 years for felony murder related to a Brinks robbery in 1981, was a presence in Tupac's early life that was mostly defined by absence. He loved the man. He would dedicate his second album to him. He grew up largely without him. And there was this as well. Afeni struggled with crack cocaine during those years. The crack epidemic that tore through black urban communities in the 1980s was not an accident of individual choices. It was a catastrophe that moved through communities already stripped of resources and opportunity. And it destroyed families with a specificity that looked to many people like intention. Afeni was one of the people it nearly destroyed. Her son watched this happen, absorbed it, and would write about it years later with remarkable honesty. There were stretches where the family had very little, where they slept in places they shouldn't have had to sleep. Tupac carried the awareness of poverty the way you carry something given to you before you were old enough to put it down. It became part of how he moved through the world, part of what drove him, and part of what made him impossible to fully contain within the category of entertainer. He was too formed by something real. He encountered Baltimore School for Arts at 15 in 1986, and it met something in him that nothing else had quite reached. It was a public magnet school focused on performing and visual arts, where students auditioned to get in, and the curriculum took the intellectual life of art seriously. He studied acting, poetry, jazz, and ballet. He was cast as the Mouse King in The Nutcracker. He threw himself into it the way he threw himself into everything, once he decided it was worth his effort. He read voraciously Makaveli's The Prince and the Art of War, Shakespeare, texts that would show up later in his music, his persona, his alias, Makaveli, and the strategic thinking about power and betrayal that ran through his later work. His classmate Jada Pinkett was one of his closest friends. She has said that he was funny, genuinely funny, in a way that people who only knew his public persona were often surprised by. He was warm, she has said, generous with his attention, but also already carrying something heavy, an awareness of where he came from, of how far he needed to go, and of how much distance separated those 2 points. The family moved again before he could graduate. Marin City, California, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, technically part of Marin County, otherwise one of the wealthiest counties in California. Marin City itself was different. A small, dense pocket of public housing built in the 1940s to house wartime workers, and never substantially redeveloped. The transition from Baltimore School for Arts to this environment was abrupt in a way that few transitions are. He was 17 without his diploma, starting over somewhere that offered a narrow set of options. He slept on couches, He sold drugs briefly. He acknowledged this himself in interviews and in the autobiographical content of his early music. He kept writing. He kept performing at parties and in ciphers. He had something, and he knew he had something, even when nothing external confirmed it. He started working his way into the Bay Area rap scene, and eventually found his way into the orbit of Digital Underground. Digital Underground, built around Gregory Jacobs, who recorded as Shock G and as the absurdist alter ego Humpty Hump, was dense with Parliament funkadelic samples and eccentric humor, their 1990 single. The Humpty Dance reached number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100. Tupac came in at the bottom. Roadie first, then dancer. Then, as his talent became impossible to ignore, a featured voice. He appeared on their 1991 album and on the soundtrack to Nothing But Trouble. He toured with them. He watched how they worked, how they handled crowds, how they moved through the business of being musicians with an industry pressing down on every side. It was an apprenticeship, not a comfortable one, but a functional one. And then he developed, in those months, the specific voice that would make his debut album what it was. Tupacalypse Now was released in November 1991. He was 20 years old. The record hit the culture with a force not fully explained by its sales numbers. The force came from something else. From the sense that here was someone saying things people recognized as true, in a way that hadn't been voiced quite like this before. Brenda's Got a Baby, based on a real news story about a 12-year-old girl in New York who gave birth alone and ended up dead, told that story in close, unsparing detail, without editorializing and without resolution. It followed the girl through the failure of every system that should have helped her, and asked the listener to sit with what that meant. Trapped addressed police harassment with the specificity of personal experience. Soldier's story insisted that choices don't happen in a vacuum, that the material conditions of a life shape what a person feels is possible. Dan Quayle, the Vice President of the United States, mentioned Tupacalypse Now by name in a public statement, arguing it endangered law enforcement. And here is what that accomplished. It made millions of people who had never heard of Tupac Shakur suddenly want to. Tupac was 20 years old. He kept working. The acting ran alongside the music from the beginning, and this is one of the things that tends to get flattened in the standard account. The tendency to treat the films as a supplement to the music, as celebrity hobby work. He had trained as an actor seriously for years, and when the right role came to him, what he could do with it was not what a rapper dabbling in front of cameras could do. Juice came out in January 1992, directed by Ernest Dickerson, who had been Spike Lee's cinematographer. Tupac played Bishop, a teenager in Harlem whose crew falls into a robbery plan that goes catastrophically wrong. Bishop starts the film as one of the group's inner circle, and then something shifts. He gets a gun, and it reveals something that was always there. A hunger for the feeling of being taken seriously, of having power in a world that has denied him every other form of it. He becomes terrifying. What makes the performance remarkable is not the menace. Menace is learnable, but the interiority. You watch Bishop and understand without the film explaining it what the logic of his choices is. At 20 years old, Tupac Shakur held that complexity in a film performance and made it real. Poetic Justice followed in 1993, directed by John Singleton, opposite Janet Jackson. A road movie and romance set in working-class Black California, about two people running from grief and toward each other. The screen chemistry was genuine. There's either something alive between two people on camera or there isn't, and there was. He would go on to Above the Rim, Gridlocked, Gang-Related. Films of varying quality, each containing work that reminded you this was not a rapper playing around in front of cameras. But 1993 was also when the world outside the studio began to intensify, in ways that would eventually consume everything else. In October 1991, Tupac had been stopped by Oakland police officers for jaywalking. The encounter escalated, and Tupac alleged that the officers beat him with sufficient force to cause injuries. He filed suit. The city of Oakland settled for $42,000. It was one of a long series of encounters with law enforcement that accumulated through those years, a pattern he understood as specific to who he was and what he looked like, and that he addressed in both interviews and music with a directness that didn't code or soften. He was becoming a symbol, not by design exactly, but by the logic of what he represented to an audience of people who recognized in his rage and his vulnerability something they felt but hadn't heard said back to them like that. In November 1993, Ayanna Jackson, a 19-year-old woman, alleged that after a consensual encounter with Tupac at a New York nightclub, she was sexually assaulted by Tupac and members of his entourage at his hotel suite. The details of the allegations, the investigation, and the trial were extensively covered and contested. What the legal record establishes: Tupac was charged, went to trial, and in February 1995 was convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to 1.5 to 4.5 years in state prison. He maintained his innocence of the specific charges for the rest of his life. And then, on the night of November 30th, 1994, something happened that changed the shape of everything. Quad Recording Studios in Midtown Manhattan. Tupac had been called in to record a verse. A legitimate session, an invitation from people he knew. He arrived in the early hours of the morning. In the lobby, 3 armed men were waiting. They robbed him. They shot him 5 times, twice in the scalp, once in the groin, once in the hand, once in the thigh. He fell. He remembered lying on the lobby floor, remembered the men rifling through his jewelry, remembered deciding that if he acted badly injured, they might leave him alone. He was right. He survived. He checked himself out of Bellevue Hospital the following day against medical advice. He arrived at his sentencing hearing in a wheelchair, head wounds covered by a bandana, facing the judge less than 24 hours after being shot 5 times in a Manhattan lobby. There is a photograph from that day in which his expression is flat and defiant, projecting an absolute refusal to show weakness to any of them. The court, the cameras, the people who did this to him. He had a theory about who was responsible. He believed he had been set up, that certain people knew he was coming to the studio that night, and said nothing. The person at the center of his suspicion was Sean Combs, founder of Bad Boy Records, and connected to that suspicion, the rapper who had been upstairs at Quad Studios that night, who came downstairs and stepped over Tupac on the way out. The notorious B.I.G., signed to Bad Boy, then in the process of becoming the East Coast counterpart to what Tupac was on the West. Whether any of the conspiracy theory was true has never been established. What is established is that Tupac believed it with absolute conviction, and that belief became a wound that kept widening, a grievance that expanded to fill whatever space was available, and which ultimately drove one of the most consequential conflicts in the history of popular music. First, he had to go to prison. He was incarcerated at Rikers Island, then transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, a maximum security prison near the Canadian border, known among inmates as Little Siberia. He read. He wrote constantly, filling notebooks with lyrics and poetry that would eventually become the majority of the material on his next records. 8 months into his sentence, Suge night arrived. Death Row Records posted Tupac's appeal bond, reported to be $1.4 million. And in exchange, Tupac signed a contract committing to deliver 3 albums to the label. He was released in October 1995. Suge and Knight had built Death Row Records through a combination of real business instinct and the willingness to apply pressure that went considerably beyond what the industry generally sanctioned. The documented accounts of contracts signed under duress, physical threats, and the atmosphere of controlled intimidation that characterized Death Row's officers are numerous enough and corroborated by enough independent sources to constitute something close to an established record. He was powerful, he was dangerous, and he was the person who got Tupac out of prison. Dr. Dre had already departed the label by this point, but Snoop Dogg was still there. And Death Row's position in West Coast hip-hop was, in late 1995, dominant. Tupac arrived and immediately began recording at a pace that even experienced observers found extreme. Part of it was the contract. 3 albums was a significant commitment, and completing it was his path to freedom from the obligation. Part of it was temperament. He had always worked fast, and was uncomfortable with the gap between having something to say and the time it took to say it. Part of it was something harder to name, a sense of urgency that people around him in that period described as palpable, as if he was running toward something or away from something, or both. All Eyez on Me was recorded in approximately 2 weeks and released on February 13th, 1996, the first double album in hip-hop history, 37 tracks across 2 discs. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 and shipped 5 million copies in its first week, becoming the fastest-selling rap album in history at that point. The record was hedonistic and elegiac simultaneously, celebratory and saturated with the awareness that being alive might not last. California Love, recorded with Dr. Dre before his departure, was one of the biggest songs of the year. How Do You Want It reached number 1. But the records that have endured are the ones with the most of him in them. The personal history, the specific anger, the vulnerability layered beneath the harder surface. And simultaneously, he was recording something else. The Makaveli project, eventually released as The Don Killuminati, The 7-Day Theory, was recorded in a reported 3 to 5 days in August 1996, less than a month before his death. He recorded it under the name Makaveli, a corruption of Machiavelli, whose thinking about power and betrayal had been preoccupying him for years. The cover image showed him crucified, arms spread, head crowned with thorns. The opening track was called Bomb First. The album was confrontational, paranoid, and in certain moments nakedly vulnerable in a way that cut through the posturing to something that felt like a person rather than a persona. It was released posthumously in November 1996. It went to number 1 on the Billboard 200. Through the first half of 1996, the conflict with the East Coast, with Bad Boy Records, with Biggie, with what Tupac characterized as an establishment that had betrayed him, was escalating past music into something more dangerous. Hit 'Em Up, released in June 1996, opens with a graphic claim about Biggie's wife, Faith Evans, and escalates from there into sustained name-naming aggression directed at Biggie, at Puffy, at Bad Boy's entire roster, at New York hip-hop. The production is raw. The rapping is technically excellent. The content is a declaration of war by a man with the platform to make that declaration heard by millions. And what made it genuinely dangerous was this: the communities surrounding these artists were not simply music fans having a spirited debate. They were people for whom the geographic and gang-affiliated coordinates of the East-West conflict had real-world implications. When death row signaled association with the Bloods, and when the response from the East Coast carried its own affiliations, the conflict had migrated out of the music and into the world the music was supposed to be describing. People who cared about both artists were frightened. There were efforts at mediation, quiet conversations, appeals to mutual friends, attempts to de-escalate through back channels. None of them worked. The conflict was too public, the pride on both sides too tied to the terms of the disagreement, the business interests of the people surrounding both artists too aligned with continuation rather than resolution. Afeni Shakur has said that in those final months, her son seemed aware of danger in a way that was qualitatively different from his usual awareness of it. He called her more. He talked about his plans, the record label, the production company, the school, the political organizing. What she communicated, and what others who knew him echoed, was a sense of someone moving fast because the time felt short. September 7th, 1996. Mike Tyson versus Bruce Seldon. The MGM Grand. The lobby altercation. The Convoy. Flamingo Road. The white Cadillac. He was gone 6 days later. And the question of who pulled the trigger and who may have known it was coming has never been officially answered. The investigation into Tupac's murder has been the subject of more journalism and independent inquiry than perhaps any unsolved murder in American popular culture. 28 years after the shooting, no one has ever been charged. The case remains officially open with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Orlando Anderson, widely suspected of being the shooter, was killed in a gang-related shooting in Compton in 1998. He denied involvement in Tupac's murder before his death. His uncle, Dwayne "Keffi" D. Davis, a Southside Compton Crip, published a memoir in 2019 and gave interviews claiming he was in the white Cadillac that night. He was arrested in Las Vegas in September 2023 and charged with murder in connection with Tupac's death, the first arrest in the case in its 27-year history. His trial was ongoing at the time of this writing. The LAPD's own potential involvement has been the subject of sustained investigative journalism, most notably by Randall Sullivan, whose book Labyrinth laid out a theory connecting death row records, corrupt LAPD officers, and the Compton underworld. A detective named Russell Poole spent years inside the LAPD pursuing those connections, specifically the involvement of an officer named David Mack and a man named Reggie Wright Jr. with ties to death row's security operation. Poole was stonewalled, reassigned, and eventually resigned. He continued pursuing the case independently. In August 2019, while presenting evidence at a meeting with San Bernardino County Sheriff's investigators, he suffered a fatal heart attack. He was 58 years old. Biggie Smalls was shot and killed on March 9, 1997, 6 months after Tupac, outside an industry party in Los Angeles. He was 24 years old. Another drive-by, another unsolved murder. Two extraordinary talents, caught in a conflict neither of them fully controlled, dead within 6 months of each other in separate drive-by shootings that have never officially been solved. The executives who had profited from the music were still alive. The artists were not. Tupac's music kept being released after his death, and that sentence sounds simple until you examine it. The posthumous catalogue grew so large, continuously produced over so many years, that the boundary between the artist and the estate, between authentic recordings and commercially assembled approximations, became genuinely difficult to locate. Suge Knight controlled the death row masters and released material quickly. The Don Killuminati was legitimate, recorded with Tupac's involvement and according to his vision. Subsequent releases became murkier. Tracks recorded years earlier reappeared with new production. Verses intended for different contexts were assembled into new configurations. Afeni Shakur fought for control of the estate through legal action, eventually secured it, established Amaru Entertainment, and oversaw the posthumous output with considerably more care. But even with her stewardship, the sheer volume of existing material and the commercial incentive to keep releasing it meant the posthumous catalogue expanded to a degree that had no real precedent in popular music. The hologram at Coachella in 2012, technically not a hologram but a Pepper's ghost projection, a 19th century stage illusion updated with CGI, showed an image of Tupac performing, interacting with Snoop Dogg, appearing to address the crowd. The clip went viral instantly. And then the conversation started. What it meant, who had authorized it, whether it was tribute or a commercial transaction dressed as tribute, whether the dead have rights over their own likeness. He couldn't weigh in. His estate had given permission. Whether he would have, the man who had been so deliberately attentive to controlling his own image and narrative, is unknowable. The money generated by his image and music in the years since his death has been reported in the hundreds of millions. His face appears on merchandise he never approved, in contexts he never could have anticipated, attached to messages that range from genuinely connected to his work to completely disconnected from it. He has been immortalized, in the most commercially literal sense of that word. What stays, though, what resists the pressure of all that, is the actual music, not all of it. The catalogue is large, and the posthumous editions include material that clearly wasn't ready for release. But there are recordings that hold up not just as cultural documents, but as actual pieces of art, work that places you inside an experience, that communicates something true. Dear Mama was released in March 1995 while Tupac was awaiting sentencing, recorded partly while he was at Rikers. It is addressed to Afeni, and what makes it remarkable is the refusal to sentimentalize her, while loving her completely. He doesn't pretend the addiction wasn't real. He doesn't pretend the chaos wasn't difficult. He describes her struggles directly, and then insists on understanding them in context, on seeing the structural forces that shaped the conditions his mother was navigating, on seeing her humanity within those forces. It is an act of empathy that requires both honesty and love simultaneously, and it holds both without letting either collapse into the other. It was the first rap song inducted into the National Recording Registry of the Library of Congress, which preserves recordings that are culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, placing it alongside recordings by Louis Armstrong, Hank Williams, and Billie Holiday. That is exactly where it belongs. Keep Your Head Up addressed black women directly, with a sincerity that made the song unusual in the context of early 1990s hip-hop, which had not historically been generous in its representations of black femininity. The song called out misogyny and insisted on the worth of black women in unconditional terms. It was also made by a man who was simultaneously capable of making music that objectified and demeaned women. Both things are true. The song is real. The contradiction is real. The music does not resolve it, because it doesn't. Changes was released posthumously in 1998, built around a sample of Bruce Hornsby and the Range's The Way It Is, a 1986 song about racial inequality. It spoke to those same themes with an urgency that felt current the year it was released, and has continued to feel current every year since. The song was written and recorded in 1992 or 1993. The world it describes has changed in some ways, and not in others. The ways it has not changed are the ones the song is about. Me Against the World, the title track from his 1995 album, is the meditation at the center of the period before the death row chapter. More introspective, more uncertain, more willing to sit with the weight of everything pressing in. He was 23 when he recorded it, between the shooting at Quad Studios and the imprisonment, in a period when the bravado was real, but so was the exhaustion. The track moves slowly, builds slowly, and in the extended outro his voice takes on a quality that is hard to describe without reaching for cliches. It sounds like someone genuinely reckoning with his life, not performing the reckoning, but doing it. He talked in interviews about wanting to be a voice for people who didn't have one. Not the voice, he was specific about that. One voice, one perspective, one way of speaking about a set of experiences that needed many. He understood that the platform was power, and that the power came with obligation. He also understood that he wasn't always equal to that obligation, that his anger sometimes outran his judgment, that the contradiction between what he preached and what he sometimes practiced was real and not going away. His influence on subsequent generations of artists is so pervasive, so woven into the fabric of what hip-hop became after him, that it has partly become invisible. The way a founding influence becomes invisible, absorbed so completely into what came after, that people who work within it don't always know they're working within it. The emotional directness, the willingness to rap about grief, about fear, about love, about doubt. To bring the interiority of experience into music that had been, in some of its dominant forms, primarily concerned with establishing status and projecting invulnerability. He did that too. But he also did the other thing. And the other thing gave generations of artists a permission they didn't know they needed, until they saw someone take it. Kendrick Lamar has spoken at length about what Tupac's music meant to him growing up in Compton, about the way it shaped his understanding of what rap could be and do, about the specific influence of the political and personal integration that made Tupac's best work feel like it was operating on multiple registers simultaneously. Kendrick's own work, Good Kid, M.A.A.D. City, To Pimp a Butterfly, Damn, is in direct conversation with that inheritance. J. Cole has cited him. Drake has cited him. Lil Wayne has spoken about Tupac with something close to reverence. Younger artists, from Vince Staples to Cordae to Rhapsody, have acknowledged the lineage. The acknowledgement matters not just as tribute, but as documentation. Here is the line of descent. Here is how the thing got passed forward. His political aspirations were real, though the form they would have taken is now unknowable. He talked about community investment, about using his resources and platform to build things in the communities he came from, about the importance of young people understanding their history and not accepting the terms given to them as natural or inevitable. He was his mother's son in this. The Panther influence was audible in how he thought, even when the organization had long since dissolved. Whether he would have followed through had he lived is a question that cannot be answered. What can be said is that the intention was there, the intelligence to execute was there, the platform was there, and that combination tends to produce something. He was a person, not a symbol, not a prophet, not an untouchable martyr. A person with the full range of what that means, including the parts that are difficult to defend, and the parts that are extraordinary, and the large middle portion that is simply human. Afeni Shakur lived for 20 years after her son's death. She died on May 2, 2016 in Sausalito, California at 69 of a reported cardiac arrest. In those 20 years, she built things. The Tupac Shakur Center for the Arts in Stone Mountain, Georgia, an arts education facility offering instruction in music, dance, drama, and visual arts to young people who might not otherwise have access to it. The kind of institution that had changed her son's life at 15. She fought for control of his estate through years of litigation, and won. She spoke publicly about him with a frankness that neither idealized nor diminished. She called out the contradictions. She acknowledged the failures. She loved him with a completeness that required seeing him clearly. She was at his bedside through all 6 of those days at University Medical Center. She was there when the doctors made the pronouncement. She has described, in a documentary interview, the moment just before his death. She leaned close and told him she loved him. She felt something leave the room. That's not a clinical description. It's not journalism. It's a mother's experience of losing her child. It belongs to her, and it belongs to the record of what happened, and there is no way to place it in a category. That does it justice. The intersection of Flamingo Road and Convoy Lane in Las Vegas still exists. It looks mostly like it always did. Traffic moves through it the way traffic moves through every intersection, indifferent to what happened there, because intersections don't hold memory. We impose memory on them. We return looking for something we already carry. The MGM Grand became the T-Mobile Arena in terms of naming rights. As such things go in Las Vegas. Club 662 closed and became something else. The city absorbed it all and kept going, because cities don't pause for individual losses, even significant ones, even in retrospect. What doesn't disappear is the voice. There is something philosophically strange about recorded sound, about the permanence of it, the way a particular configuration of vibrations in a particular room can be preserved and played back indefinitely, heard by people born decades after the sound was first made. Tupac knew this. He talked about it. He talked about wanting to make something that would outlive the circumstances that produced it, something that would speak to people in situations he couldn't predict, in years he wouldn't reach. He got that. The music is there. The voice is there. And the argument he was making about what it is to be alive in a particular body, in a particular country, in a particular moment, is not a historical argument. It is an argument that keeps finding new applications, that keeps being heard by people for whom it is the first time, and for whom it is immediate. A kid in a public housing project in Baltimore, who ended up in an art school performing Shakespeare and ballet. A young man sleeping on couches in Marin City, with notebooks full of poetry. A roadie who became a rapper, who became an actor, who became an icon, who was shot 5 times in a Manhattan lobby and walked out of the hospital the next day in a wheelchair to face a judge. A man making some of the most vital music of his generation, while carrying a conviction, a feud, and a certainty that his life was going to end early. Who recorded an album in 3 days that felt like a goodbye letter. Who drove through Las Vegas on a warm Saturday night in September, past the casinos and the tourists, and the ordinary chaos of a city that doesn't sleep, toward a party, toward the next thing, toward whatever comes after this. 25 years old. The voice is still there. It's still making its argument. It's still finding the people who need to hear it, in the middle of their particular circumstances, their particular hour at 3 in the morning, when everything is pressing down. He wanted to be heard. He is heard. Whether that is consolation or tragedy or both, it probably depends on who you are, and what you brought to this, and what you're carrying when you turn it on. The night was warm. The lights were everywhere. And then, they weren't.